A deal on a trade deal with the UK by the end of October has not yet been written off for some MEPs. But negotiations would have to take place around the clock for the next 2 weeks, said David McAllister from the German Christian Democratic Union, the CDU, and Bernd Lange from the Social Democratic Party of Germany, the SPD, before the EU summit in Brussels. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson will probably decide by Monday whether Great Britain wants to continue negotiations, said McAllister. Even if Johnson decides to do so, the outcome of the talks is still uncertain. For a long time, the chances of success were estimated at around 40%. Whether that will succeed is really in the stars, said the SPD MEP. As I mentioned in a video some time ago, it is now either the quote from the singer Katja Epstein, "Miracles are always possible," or from the singer Christian Anders, "There is a train going nowhere." And Bernd Lange repeated it this time. Johnson originally set the EU a deadline of October 15th for an agreement. If we don't come to an agreement by then, I don't see that there will be a free trade agreement between us. There's no longer any talk of that. From the British side, it was said on Wednesday that they were worried about the schedule. The European Union had not moved as fast as had been hoped in the past 2 weeks. But it was even denied that Johnson had even set an ultimatum. On Wednesday, however, the British head of government announced that he would wait for the 2-day EU summit, which ends today. At the summit, Chancellor Angela Merkel and her EU colleagues discuss how a trade agreement can still succeed. For the heads of state or government, it was after all the first real debate about their relationship with the United Kingdom since spring 2018. And that's not entirely safe to do so. Is the EU's negotiating front, which has been stable for years, showing cracks for the first time now that the end of the transition period is getting closer and closer? After all, not all countries will suffer equally if customs duties are incurred on imports and exports to the EU from January 2021. It will be a very sober debate about the status of the negotiations without any unrest, said the EU Commission soothingly before the summit started. In a new draft of the summit declaration, which is available to the DPA news agency, and I'm quoting it here because of that, the EU has made the British government responsible. The summit wants to commission EU Chief Negotiator Michel Barnier to continue negotiations in the next few weeks and calls on Great Britain to take the necessary steps to make an agreement possible. The contract is intended to regulate economic relations after the Brexit transition phase, so that means from 2021, and prevent tariffs and trade barriers. The game played by British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is particularly transparent. He's blackmailing the community of the 27 EU states with a law that has not yet been finally passed in London and which is to be adapted to the status of the negotiations as desired. But what's Johnson's calculation? If the EU accommodates him in the negotiation, he wants to defuse the law that violates international law again. If the community does not follow his course, however, a hard border could emerge in the former civil war zone in the north of the island of Ireland. EU Commission Chief Ursula von der Leyen has rightly initiated infringement proceedings against the British Internal Market Act, which could provoke such a dire development. Before Johnson drops his threat, he should give in on several key points, especially in the actual post-Brexit negotiations. On the one hand, this concerns the question of whether the European Court of Justice, the ECJ, should continue to play a role in disputes between the EU 27 and Great Britain. The London ignition with the Northern Ireland regulation shows that the EU must also be able to involve the ECJ in European law disputes. The EU should also not let Johnson get away with it if he demands future access to the EU internal market and at the same time wants to say goodbye to EU environmental and social legislation. Chief Negotiator Michel Barnier spoke to many stakeholders in the days leading up to the summit. On Tuesday, with the European ministers and the coordination group in the European Parliament, on Wednesday with the College of Commissioners. As always, Barnier was concentrated, focused, optimistic about finding a solution, but realistic about the limits, said the first Vice President of the Commission, Frans Timmermans, afterwards. We hear from the briefings that Barnier is now adopting a friendlier tone. After months of complaining about British intransigence, he is now praising the fact that there is movement, albeit nowhere near enough. His counterpart, the British chief negotiator David Frost, signaled flexibility on one of the central points of contention, the subsidies, last week. They talk about whether it is possible to go further than usual in free trade agreements and to agree on some regulations that restrict and shape the subsidy policy in both sides, he told a House of Lords committee. It is like so often with our British friends, comments a high-ranking EU diplomat. First, they reject the proposal as absolutely unacceptable, and then 2 weeks later they say, "Why not? Sounds interesting. Let's talk." Barnier reported to MPs that the British are now ready to get involved in state aid wording as contained in the EU free trade agreement with Japan. Reference is made there to international standards. But that shouldn't be a problem because the EU-Japan state aid rules are not as strict as the UK-Japan state aid rules. In the FTA, the UK negotiated with Japan that time. Of course, this is not enough for the EU. They demand that the British continue to adhere to the European minimum standards for social, environmental and labour law, but above all, to observe the rules for granting subsidies. Behind this is the concern that the British could deliberately undercut standards and generously distribute subsidies in order to gain competitive advantages. London rejects this as an interference with its sovereignty. One solution could be to lay down the previous EU rule as minimum standards and to allow the British to undercut them in individual cases. But then you have to be able to impose sanctions, such as punitive tariffs on individual products, immediately and without complicated procedures, according to the EU Commission. That has to do with a second difficult subject. The EU wants to agree on a resilient dispute settlement mechanism. The issue has become even more important since London's Single Market Bill overrode important provisions of the withdrawal agreement, characterizing it itself as a limited breach of international law. Brussels has therefore initiated infringement proceedings, but it now demands guarantees that the British government will proceed in a similar manner with an agreement on future relations if it becomes inconvenient. We have to have a robust mechanism in order to be able to react quickly to lazy tricks by the British, says the EU Commission. This includes that the United Kingdom recognizes the primacy of the European Court of Justice in disputes relating to European law. There is still no sign of any movements on this point on the British side. The third point of contention concerns fisheries. From an economic point of view, this is a marginal issue for the whole of the EU and for the UK. But the Brexiteers have promised that the sovereign island will again have full control over their fishing grounds. On the other hand, the EU is demanding that essentially everything stays as it is, as a price to pay for the fact that the British are allowed to continue selling their fish in Europe despite the exit and gain access to the energy and financial markets. In France, Belgium and Ireland, this issue affects important groups of voters. But the EU27, who received a picture of the situation from EU chief negotiator Michel Barnier in Brussels on Thursday, must be honest. It's politically unwise for France's head of state Emmanuel Macron to use the stage at the Brussels summit to make himself the top lobbyist for French fishermen on the question of the future use of British fishing grounds, another open point in the negotiations, as I said. The dispute over fishing is really primarily symbolic and nothing else. At the end of September, London offered a 3-year transition period during which the current catch quotas will gradually be reduced. Paris refused by return of post, and Barnier's request to the states that he should be given more leeway on this issue has so far remained unheard. If we are in agreement on everything, it will not fail because of the fishery, it is said from the negotiating circles. Reference is made to a 5 billion Brexit aid fund, which was launched in July as part of the large financial package with Corona aid. This could be used to compensate for part of the missing income. In total, European fishermen are only concerned with a volume of 650 to 800 million euros per year. The EU negotiators believe they are in a stronger negotiating position than their UK partners, and it's not too, well, let's say, unrealistic to think that. Not only because the consequences of an exit without an agreement would be much greater for the island's economy than for the entire Union, but also because Johnson put himself in a difficult position. Because of the poor management of the pandemic, he now has his back to the wall and cannot afford another failure. In addition, the single market bill backfired because America made compliance with Northern Ireland a condition for a bilateral trade agreement. Johnson has realized that he can no longer take full risk, says the Commission. In fact, almost all attention on the island is currently focused on the corona situation and the constantly changing requirements which cut into the lives of citizens more directly and sometimes more painfully than what has been felt by Brexit so far. As recently as last year, the exit negotiations had dominated British politics. Back then, it was about everything. The political survival of Prime Minister Theresa May, later that of Boris Johnson, and even Brexit itself always seemed to be on the brink. Many British people now have the impression that only detailed issues are being clarified in Brussels. Technical, difficult to understand trade problems. Only those companies that are intertwined with the European internal market appear nervous. Their bosses and association representatives have expressed increasing anger since they have been regularly asked by the government to prepare with more energy for the post-Brexit changes. It seems to them that the government is trying to shift responsibility for possible border chaos after December 31st to the economy and the companies. Although Brexit will only get its real face with these negotiations, political emotion has left the debate. Labour leader Keir Starmer, who had led the fight against Brexit in the House of Commons for years, is no longer involved. The battle is over, he says again and again, expressing a tiredness, even exhaustion, that has gripped the entire camp of the Remainers. The so-called Remainers, now there are no Remainers anymore, they can only be rejoiners now. Just a small side note for the trolls, Remoaner is an insult and it won't get through to the comments because it's a blocked word on my channel. Just for your information. But let's continue. Boris Johnson got a historic majority in Parliament 10 months ago for his Brexit plan and no longer really has to fear any major contradiction in Europe on issues within his own ranks. The outcry over the government's admission that its Single Market Act is violating international law has largely subsided. The rebellion in British House of Commons led by Theresa May resulted in a few dissenting votes. Now the law is being discussed in the House of Lords. Most now see the legislative proposal for what it probably was, an attempt to increase the pressure on the negotiating partner. At the same time, the controversial law contained a message to the Brexiteers in the Conservative parties. You should get the impression that Johnson is fighting hard in the negotiations. In the end, this could make it easier for them to accept the compromises they need to make. Where the next two rounds of negotiations are to take place has at least already been clarified. Next week it would be London, the week after next Brussels. Then it's over, says SPD MEP Bernd Lange, who belongs to the Brexit contact group in the European Parliament. Even if we have a finished negotiating text on October 31st, it still has to be translated, legally checked and approved. That simply cannot be done in less than 2 months. In fact, so far there has not even been a common negotiating text. In the negotiations on the exit agreement, there were drafts with pieces of text in 2 colors. Green stood for agreed, red for disputed. In the negotiations about the future relationship, the dispute over the 3 fundamental issues has blocked any text work so far. Barnier is betting that the British will come to terms with integrating the solutions to the 3 issues in the text presented by the European Union in the spring, said Brussels. In addition to the Brexit dispute, the summit agenda included a debate on tightening the EU climate target. Germany is pulling along, and the corona crisis, which has returned with power. The heads of state and government also wanted to discuss the gas dispute with Turkey and the expansion of relations with Africa. At the beginning, it was about the stalling negotiations with the European Parliament about the EU budget framework and the Corona development package. Here, Parliament President David Sassoli made additional demands, which, according to diplomats, were unanimously rejected. Probably the biggest headache for the EU member states is the threat of an economic break with Great Britain. In the end of the year, the United Kingdom is leaving the internal market and the customs union. The envisaged trade pact is supposed to prevent tariffs and other trade barriers, but it is far from finished. And so this took over a lot of the first day. And as you know, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson had asked for an agreement by October 15th. After the summit, he wants to decide whether he will continue the negotiations in the next few weeks. Merkel said we had to come to a fair agreement from which both sides could benefit. Well worth the effort. EU Chief Commissioner Ursula von der Leyen praised that a lot of good work had already been done. However, 2 decisive points are open. The question of a level playing field in return for British access to the EU internal market and fishing rights. France, in particular, is insisting that EU fishermen continue to fish in British waters. Under no circumstances should our fishermen be the victims of Brexit, said Macron, and also emphasized there will not be an agreement at any price. Several heads of state and government expressed confidence that a deal would be possible, such as Estonia's Prime Minister Jüri Ratas. With a view to the envisaged new EU climate target, 11 of the 27 states took the initiative before the summit and expressly supported the EU Commission's proposal to reduce greenhouse gases by at least 55% below the 1990 level by 2030. Merkel again signaled support for this. It would be important if the EU member states jointly committed to this goal by December, said the CDU politician. At least that's what Germany will do. So far, the target for 2030 has been minus 40%. Some EU states are still skeptical, including Poland, which is heavily dependent on coal. Czech Prime Minister Andrej Babiš also said that his country would not achieve such a strong reduction in greenhouse gases. But he is not fundamentally against the 55% target if other countries take on more reductions. EU Council Chairman Charles Michel said that we now have to see which building blocks are necessary to convince all EU states of the 55% target. Among other things, it is about financial aid for restructuring the economy. Climate protection is extremely important, said Michel. With a new climate target, the EU wants to help implement the Paris Climate Agreement and stop the dangerous overheating of the Earth. Michel was very concerned about the rapidly increasing corona numbers all over Europe. The summit today will deal with this issue in detail, and the aim is closer coordination, among other things, in contract tracking and quarantine rules in order to limit the spread of the virus. And even in Germany, the numbers are rising at the moment, not as bad as before. And if you look on a European map at the moment, around us it looks much worse than in Germany. But we all have to work for this to get this down again. Denmark's Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen told the Ritzau agency that the summit should have been held online rather than on site. In fact, von der Leyen had to leave the council building immediately after the start. After someone from her staff tested positive, the 62-year-old went into quarantine. And if you now had enough from politics, please try and visit my new channel. It's in German, but don't worry, you don't have to understand the language. First of all, there are automated English subtitles, which are bad, I know, but you will just get what it is about. It's not about politics, you don't have to understand what I'm saying, it's just fun. But if you still do want to see something about European or global politics, YouTube has chosen another of my videos right here for you in the end screen. I'll see you on my new channel or in my next video. Click and enjoy. Viel Spaß!